Panama Canal Society has the pleasure to have author and professor Wendy Tribaldos from Panama as our 2025 annual luncheon guest speaker. Wendy is a professor of social sciences and history with a degree from Notre Dame of Maryland University. She has advanced studies in educational administration and leadership from the University of New Orleans, and in museology and management of nonprofit organizations from Johns Hopkins University. She managed the educational program Aprendo of the newspaper La Prensa, obtaining multiple national and international distinctions for her work in favor of Panamanian children and youth. Today, she is dedicated to project management, focused mainly on the documentation and conservation of the nation's natural and cultural heritage. Today, Wendy will be discussing her book, January 9th, 1964. This book addresses the events of January 1964 through a fresh narrative that gives context and voice to its Panamanian and North American protagonists with the support of powerful images, many never seen before. So it is my pleasure to introduce Wendy Tribaldos.
Good afternoon. How are you? I am so happy to be here and really thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about a subject that is both deeply personal and endlessly fascinating to me, one that has become a labor of love and passion over many years. I am Panamanian, born and raised, but all of my higher education took place in the United States. I believe that combination of perspectives, one deeply rooted in my national identity and the other one grounded in academic objectivity, has allowed me to approach the history of U.S.-Panama relations with both empathy and analytic rigor. Today, I'd like to talk about an event that was key in Panama's modern history and central to the long, often complicated relationship between our two countries. The student protests and ensuing violence of January 9th, 1964, known in Panama as Martyrs' Day. I spent more than 5 years researching the events leading up and following that day. The result was a book published in Panama in 2023, which reconstructs the story using hundreds of photographs and documents, many of them from American sources. The work has also expanded in Panama to include museum exhibits, to include lectures, teaching tools aimed at helping mostly Panamanian students and educators think critically about history, not as a myth or memory, but as a science of evidence and interpretation. But first, let me offer a bit of context and a personal anecdote. In June 2018, while finishing a master's degree in museum studies at Johns Hopkins University, I accepted the curatorship of an exhibit titled The Road to Sovereignty, January 9th, 1964, from the now defunct Panama City Museum. While I initially assumed it would be a relatively straightforward project, quickly revealed itself to be far more complex. The textbook version of the events often sounds deceptively simple. On that day, around 200 students from Panama's Instituto Nacional, the country's most prestigious high school of the time, marched peacefully to Balboa High School in the Canal Zone to protest the failure to comply with a bilateral flag agreement between Panama and the United States. The zone, as you all know, was an enclave carved out of Panamanian territory through a 1903 treaty negotiated, crucially, without a single Panamanian representative at the table. That treaty was signed just 15 days after Panama's separation from Colombia. Over the decades, tensions simmered. While the Canal Zone stood as a symbol of American engineering prowess and military strength, for Panamanians, it represented a daily reminder of lost sovereignty. The American flag flying over the zone land without the Panamanian flag alongside it came to symbolize the latter. Which brings us to January 9th, 1964. On that fateful day, as tensions mounted in front of Balboa High School, the Panamanian flag carried by the Instituto students was torn in a devastating symbolic insult that sparked national outrage. What followed was an explosion of violence, property damage, injuries, deaths on both sides, and a rupture in diplomatic relations between Panama and the United States that lasted until April 3rd, 1964. Because images can communicate what words cannot, I'd like to show you a short excerpt of the video documenting what happened on the lawn in front of Balboa High School 61 years ago. The full video, it's called Summary of Panama Canal Riots, is housed in the U.S. National Archives, and it's 27 minutes long. We'll be watching just the first 4 minutes. This is the only footage from the archives about the January 1964 events that has been digitized to my knowledge.
The Panama riots were touched off at approximately 4:40 Thursday afternoon when about 200 students from the Panamanian High School, the Instituto Nacional, arrived at Balboa School in the Canal Zone. The Panamanian students were stopped across the street from the school. They carried an assortment of Panamanian flags in the Canal Zone, and only the Panamanian flag. Captain Gaddis Wall of the Zone Police learned zone students. Many of the zone students were moved into the school library. But the Panamanian students changed their minds and instead demanded to fly their flag from the high school flagpole and sing their national anthem. This was not permitted. The students' apparent leader, Guillermo Guevara Paz, had lengthy discussions with the student group, but had considerable difficulty in reconciling their extreme intentions and commanding their attention. After considerable discussion, the Panamanian students agreed to a ceremony consisting of a 5-student delegation carrying the flag to the pole, holding it up for all to see and to be photographed, and closing with the singing of their national anthem. As the student delegation approached the flagpole, the principal of Balboa High School appealed to the Canal Zone students to maintain proper decorum. Meanwhile, buses had been secured to transport the Panamanian students from the zone as further insurance against conflict between the student groups. The arrival of the Panamanian delegation caused a large crowd to press around the flagpole. Captain Wall requested zone students to be respectful and explained the purpose of the student delegation. Nevertheless, emotional tensions began to build up between the two student groups. The Panamanian students objected to the agreed-upon ceremony and vehemently argued for some 20 minutes to fly the Panamanian flag from the single pole bearing the United States flag. They became completely unreasonable, and finally it was necessary for the zone police to move the Panamanian students away from the flagpole. This was done with a persistent police line and without injury to any of the students. Emotions were high, and the Panamanian students became extremely disorderly after being removed from the vicinity of the flagpole. At least one policeman required medical attention after being struck by one of the many objects thrown by the students. Darkness began to settle over the area. Without warning, the Panamanian students suddenly bolted and ran up the hill toward the Panama Canal Company Administration building.
The January 1964 events became a turning point in Panama's long quest to revise the Canal Zone treaties. Panama's struggle became no longer symbolic. It became a serious diplomatic issue. And yet, despite their historical significance, these events remain relatively underexplored in both Panama and the United States. In Panama, the dominant narrative often slips into a kind of historical negativismo, a version wrapped in myth-making and patriotic fervor. U.S. historian Alec McPherson has noted, quite rightly, that some Panamanians during the official investigations distorted evidence or exaggerated claims to defend their moral position. And frankly, it's understandable. After all, Panama was striving to expose what it saw as the profound injustice of U.S. colonial control over part of its national territory. McPherson also points out that Panama's rightful claims to sovereignty has sometimes overshadowed deeper or more critical investigations of what is still often referred to as la gesta gloriosa, the glorious feat. But I wanted to go beyond slogans and look at the facts. What really happened? Who made the decisions? And what were their motivations? What January 1964 ultimately taught Panamanians was this: change would require more than protests. It would demand skilled diplomacy. And it worked. That strategy ultimately succeeded, culminating in the signing of the Canal Treaties between the United States and Panama in 1977, and the full transfer of the canal and the former zone lands to Panama by December 31st, 1999. When I began writing the book, my foremost goal was to counteract the simplification and emotional distortions that often dominate our local narratives. As a historian, my job was to sort through the myths, emotions, and political noise. So I built a detailed day-by-day timeline of events from January 2nd to January 14, 1964, focusing particularly on the tense interactions along the border between Panama City and the zone. I'll admit, I really agonized about how the book would be received in my country. As I have pointed out, the history of this period is steeped with passion and often more shaped by ideology than fact. But to my surprise, the book was well received, perhaps because 6 decades have passed, and perhaps also because Panama now controls and manages the canal and the former zone lands. The emotional charge of the events has somewhat eased, allowing for a more critical approach. A key intent was to weave both Panamanian and North American perspectives into the narrative, supported by hundreds of photographs, some from public archives, others from private collections. These were not merely illustrations. They were primary sources, vital to presenting visual and factual evidence. It might seem like a normal modus operandi for any reputable historian, but in Panama, where much of the 1964 narrative is still so steeped in blood, violence, and martyrdom rhetoric, it was an absolute must. I recognized early on that oversimplified or glorified narratives do not serve the long-term interest of either country. Demystifying the events and its protagonists also allowed me to humanize them and thus bring them closer to all of us today. My years as a journalist in Panama also taught me the immense power of these images to convey historical context, emotion, and meaning. That visual element was especially important in researching my primary audience, high school and university students in Panama. This was because what struck me the most while working on the book was how much of this story revolves around teenagers, students on both sides, who through their actions helped change the history of two nations. So I'd like to spend a few moments discussing what might have motivated the students at Balboa High School to raise the U.S. flag in January 1964, defying a direct order from zone authorities. This was no small act. Certainly, it must have not been an easy decision. The removal of the American flag deeply upset many Zonians. As historian and diplomat William Jordan noted, the mood of frustration and indignation was palpable in many Zone households. It was not strange that teenagers absorbed their parents' anger. What struck me as a historian was how they reacted with a mix of defiance and conviction. It must be remembered that life in the zone was highly structured, and orders from the Panama Canal Company or the governor were to be followed, period. Not following rules could mean firing or even deportation. So for these Balboa High School students to defy authority by raising their flag was an act of real civil disobedience, and a brave one at that. But it also lit the spark of a long simmering fire in Panama. The anger and frustrations that Zonians felt for a few days over the removal of their flag mirrored what Panamanians had felt for more than 60 years, as part of their country was, in effect, a foreign colony. The treaty that created the zone was seen as a necessity to obtain Panama's independence, but it left an enclave within its borders over which it had no control. Sovereignty became the central issue of contention, with the U.S. interpreting the treaty as full authority and Panama seeing it as a concession of jurisdiction, not ownership. For many Balboa High School students, lowering the U.S. flag in January of 1964 was akin to erasing their nation's presence. Their flag, which was also found in all classrooms, was an important element of group affiliation. It symbolized belonging. Their daily routines, including the ROTC's ceremonial raising and lowering of the flag every single day, instilled deep national pride. Every day, the students swore loyalty to the U.S. flag and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And they were sent to the principal if any student forgot to say it. One Balboa student described it simply: "When our flag flies, we don't feel so far away from home." In fact, many second and third generation Zonians felt even more American than mainland Americans. Living overseas made them cling harder to their national identity. One zone policeman put it bluntly: "We were lost Americans." They often saw themselves as stewards of a strategic and economic marvel, and many of them felt unrecognized for their sacrifice. Historian McPherson points out that the teenagers at Balboa High School considered themselves specially guardians of the zone and in what represented to its inhabitants. It should not be overlooked that many of their fathers and grandfathers literally built the Panama Canal. Consequently, there was often a deep sense of personal or family pride and ownership within the Sonian communities. This bond of attachment to the canal and the surrounding land was strong. The importance of the canal to U.S. defense and commerce further shaped Sonian attitudes. Consequently, many felt they were, in essence, making a patriotic sacrifice by working outside of the U.S. to support these national objectives. Given such personal sacrifices, the general canal zone benefits were considered to be fully justified, though these privileges were both a source of envy and resentment among many Panamanians. It must also be acknowledged that Sonians received a U.S.-centric education, with little attention to Panamanian history. This might have played a hand in developing a Sonian perspective that tended to place Panama in a position of national indebtedness to the United States. A prevalent belief was that the U.S. played a central role in the creation and sustenance of the Republic of Panama, leading to the expectation that Panamanians should express gratitude towards Americans. One common viewpoint among Sonians was that the U.S. presence in Panama contributed to the country's modernization, transforming it from an impoverished and isolated Colombian province into a modern republic. In keeping with U.S. citizens of that era, many Sonians probably also possessed a latent notion of U.S. exceptionalism that could be considered a remnant of the manifest destiny doctrines from the prior century. While some of these characteristics may have been present, it is my belief many Sonians would probably object to assertions that creating and maintaining the Panama Canal Zone as a distinct U.S. enclave was motivated by prejudice or assumed cultural superiority, although these were certainly present in certain areas of the zone. Also, racial segregation existed in the zone, as did it in the United States at that time, and young Sonians absorbed these biases. Sonians might argue instead that other practical motivators and reasoning were much more likely reason behind the creation of the Canal Zone, like, for example, its strategic and economic importance to their nation. Many Sonians also lived in near complete isolation from Panamanians, as the Canal Zone was structured as a self-sufficient enclave subsidized by the U.S. government. For many of its residents, the canal and the carefully planned and landscaped zone were perceived as tangible evidence of their nation's superiority, particularly when it was contrasted with the perception of inferiority that many had of Panama and Panamanians. Also, a number of Sonians tended to view Panamanians with suspicion. As a result of having full employment, good incomes, and zero tolerance for law breaking, the Canal Zone saw very little crime committed by its inhabitants. At the same time, there was sustained petty theft in the Canal Zone that was attributed overwhelmingly to poor Panamanians. Over the decades, this led many Sonians to suspect any unfamiliar Panamanians. The adult Sonians also typically socialized with other Sonians almost exclusively, and not with the Panamanians. As with many other aspects of Sonian-Panamanian relations, social interactions likely involved misunderstandings and erroneous assumptions. The divide was not just political or geographic. It was social, it was cultural, and it was psychological. When considered collectively, these views led many Sonians to regard any protest led by Panamanians as ungrateful. However, given Panamanian history, such a judgment may be deemed overly harsh, as the country did have legitimate grievances regarding the Canal Treaty and its subsequent interpretation. These grievances and their historical roots were often unrecognized or misunderstood by a large group of Sonians. Meanwhile, across the border in Panama City, the students of the Instituto Nacional shared a patriotic zeal equal to their counterparts at Balboa High School, but directed at their own nation. Founded in 1911, the beautiful and monumental Instituto was a beacon of critical thinking and civic education. It taught students not what to think, but how to think. They were taught by their eminent professors that the Canal Zone was part of their country and that it was wrongly occupied. Like Balboa students, they saluted their flag, sang their national anthem, and felt a deep sense of national pride. The Institutore's decision to march into the zone on January 9, 1964, was indeed a risk to them. But it wasn't an ambush. It was an act of youthful conviction and patriotic duty, much like the motivations of Balboa high schoolers. It was also unannounced and unexpected by zone authorities and occurred in spite of their advanced plans to block disturbances in the area. The march proceeded unimpeded, as there was no choice but to allow this demonstration once it was already underway. And while zone officials tried to de-escalate, events unfolded too quickly. The rest, as they say, it's history. I've spent many hours speaking with many of those Instituto students. Their mission, they told me, was simple: one territory, one flag. Now, in the twilights of their lives, many wonder what drives today's youths, regardless of their nationality. That question was one of the main reasons for me writing this book. I wanted to spark reflection among young Panamanians, to inspire them to connect to the past with the present and use it to imagine a better future. I strongly believe in the capabilities of young people. Again and again, as a historian, as an educator, as a museum professional, I've seen what they can do when they're given the right tools, the trust, and the chance to act. Yet, too often, they're dismissed as lazy or apathetic. All of this complicates for them being catalysts for the changes Panama so urgently needs today. But complexity is not impossibility. I have faith in them. What else will you find in my book? You will find a call to reflect on the importance of historical memory, how it fades, how it can be manipulated, and how we must protect it to better understand the layered realities of sovereignty, identity, and nationalism. I discuss how many of the objects and places tied to these events have changed, limiting our ability to connect with their history. You'll also read about the role of information, misinformation, and the absence of information, and how these shaped how the violence of the time and the diverging national narratives that emerged. And you'll encounter the steady erosion of collective memory in Panama around these events, especially since the U.S. withdrawal in 1999. Today, January 9th, 1964, is increasingly less understood by younger generations. Many people today in Panama barely know this history, and it's rarely taught in a meaningful way. Some may argue that we've forgotten it because it served its purpose. But forgetting also creates an opportunity for rediscovery, for reevaluation, and for deeper and renewed understanding. We can approach the past with fresh eyes, using diverse sources and analytical rigor. History, especially one as emotionally charged as this episode, deserves, rather needs to be examined with both discipline and objectivity. The young people of today face different challenges, yes, but the values, that inspired both American and Panamanian youth in 1964 are timeless. Civic duty, national pride, and moral courage. Many basic questions that were vital long ago also remain relevant today and open to debate. How do we respond to injustice? What does sovereign mean in a globalized world? And how do we teach history that is both honest and empathetic? I believe we must not shirk from our duty to prepare the young the best we can, regardless of your countries of origin. We must educate them, trust them, and above everything, give them the opportunity to lead us. So yes, in this newly translated version of my book, you'll find a detailed historical account of the events of January 1964, but you'll also find a call to reflect, to question inherited narratives, and to honor the facts and the emotions of both the U.S. and Panama's shared history. I hope this book and this conversation can contribute to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of what happened and why it still matters and it's important today. If this book helps anyone, young or old, reflect on who we were, who we are, and where we're heading, then it will have fulfilled its purpose. Thank you so much for giving me the honor of sharing these thoughts with you. I truly enjoy reading the book as much as I did writing it. I have some copies here if you want some of them. I'll be there autographing them, and I would like to offer a special thanks to the Sonians who contributed their valuable time and insight in reviewing my text. And above all, a big I love you to my Uncle George, to whom this book is dedicated, with deep admiration from this Panamanian sobrina. Thank you very much.